Survey of the Outer World, Pseudology Applied. Collegium of Structural Truths, External Survey Division CST EXT OW001, Survey of the Outer World. Ongoing Assessment, Active Unraveling Candidate. Pseudology Applied, the Lie Craft through the Ages, in the Present, and in the Time that Remains. Subject Human Civilization. Collegium Assessment 7th Unraveling Candidate. The Outer World, the civilization observed from beyond the standard survey radius, presents the most complex and sustained case of distributed pseudology in the Collegium's entire record. It is not a case of one void tongue-eroding reality from a single point of practice. It is, and has been for the entirety of its documented history, a civilization in which the production of structural falsehood has been embedded at every level of social, political, religious, economic, and now technological organization, a civilization that discovered the art without ever naming it, practiced every grade from I through VI across every century of its existence, and is now, in the period under current review, approaching the conditions under which a distributed grade 7 event becomes not merely possible but structurally inevitable. This survey examines that history, age by age, as it actually was, a long record of the lie craft at work on the load-bearing structure of a shared reality, and what that record says about where the structure now stands. Reference grade classifications applied. Reference section. The 7 grades applied to history. A compressed reference for use throughout this survey, each grade is illustrated with its historical signature. Before proceeding through the historical survey, the following grade reference establishes how each class of pseudology event manifests at civilizational scale. At individual scale, the grades describe what a single practitioner does and what it costs them. At civilizational scale, they describe what a culture does to its own structural fabric, and what it costs the fabric. Grade 1, Self-Deception, Civilizational Signature, the Comfortable Myth. At scale, the foundational stories a civilization tells about itself that are not quite true and are maintained against countervailing evidence by collective preference. National founding myths, the virtuous war narrative, the belief in one's own exceptionalism. Grade 1 at civilizational scale produces what the Collegium calls ambient drift, a slow, continuous, undetected departure of the collective self-concept from accurate description. Every civilization practices this continuously. The lacunae are small, they accumulate. 2. Grade 2, Relational Lies, Civilizational Signature, Structural Deception. At scale, the organized deceptions a society maintains between its power structures and the people they govern. The lie of consent, the promise not intended to be kept, the representation of interest as service. This grade is so thoroughly normalized in most civilizations that it has ceased to register as a structural event. It is experienced as politics, advertising, and management. The lacunae it produces are also normalized. They are called disillusionment. They are called cynicism. They are not recognized as physical damage to the load-bearing structure of shared reality. They are that anyway. 3. Grade 3, Material Falsehood, Civilizational Signature, Manufactured Fact. At scale, the deliberate, organized production of false assertions about specific material facts for strategic purposes. Propaganda, scientific fraud commissioned by industrial interests. The curated false statistic, the manufactured atrocity claim used to justify intervention. This grade, at civilizational scale, produces lacunae in the epistemic commons, in the shared pool of facts that a civilization uses to navigate decisions. A lacuna in the epistemic commons is a permanent gap in a society's capacity to reason accurately about specific subjects. These gaps do not heal when the lie is exposed. The exposure merely describes the lacuna. The lacuna remains. IV. Grade 4, Identity Dissolution, Civilizational Signature, Manufactured People. At scale, the systematic replacement of authentic collective identity with constructed identity, the assertion, across a population, of a version of themselves that is false but maintained by sufficient institutional force that it becomes load-bearing. The colonial subject told, persistently and violently, that their culture did not exist. The citizen of a totalitarian state whose entire social identity is constructed by the state apparatus. The consumer whose desires are manufactured and then reflected back as authentic. Grade 4 at civilizational scale produces lacunae in personhood, not one person's identity but a people's capacity to know themselves. V. Grade 5, historical rejection, civilizational signature, the erased past. At scale, the deliberate, organized removal of historical events from the collective record, not merely censorship but ontological claim. The assertion, with institutional force, that something that happened did not happen. The burning of records, the falsification of census data, the rewriting of textbooks, the monuments torn down and replaced with different ones asserting a different history. This grade does not merely mislead, it creates a structural failure in the civilization's capacity to place itself correctly in time. A civilization that does not know where it has been cannot navigate toward where it is going. It moves through a present that it cannot read, because the past that would make the present legible has been amputated. VI. Grade 6, mass delusion, civilizational signature, reality by consensus. At scale, an event in which the shared consensus reality of a significant portion of a civilization becomes systematically false on a fundamental structural axis, not merely mistaken but load-bearing in its wrongness, sustained by collective affirmation at sufficient density to resist correction by individual or institutional evidence. The most destructive ideological mass movements of the outer world's recent history are Grade 6 events. The Collegium notes that Grade 6 does not require malicious orchestration. It can emerge from the spontaneous mutual amplification of widely held Grade 1 and Grade 2 errors. The lacunae from a Grade 6 event are rarely localized. They are distributed through the structure of shared meaning itself. 7. Grade 7, the sincere lie, civilizational signature, unknown, no surviving record. At civilizational scale, a Grade 7 event has never been fully documented. By definition, it cannot be. A sincere lie held by sufficient collective conviction produces a lacuna that removes the documentation of its own occurrence. What the Collegium can assess is the precondition, a civilization in which the mechanisms for distinguishing personal conviction from verified fact have degraded sufficiently that a false belief can be held with the total quality of truth by enough people, simultaneously, to constitute a load-bearing event. The outer world is currently under assessment for this condition. The assessment is ongoing. The assessors acknowledge that they are conducting it from inside the world they are assessing. Survey of Prehistoric Foundation. Survey Part 1, Earliest Record. The Prehistoric Foundation, the First Lies. Approximately 300,000 BCE to 3000 BCE, reconstructed from inference and material record, reliability, uncertain. There is a question the Collegium has not been able to resolve and will not resolve. When did the first outer world human produce the first lacuna? The answer would tell us when the load began to accumulate. The material record is insufficient. But the structural inference is not. Language capable of producing Grade 1 self-deception almost certainly predates writing by tens of thousands of years, and the capacity for Grade 2, deliberate relational dishonesty, is almost certainly as old as the capacity for complex social organization. The species did not discover the lie craft. The lie craft and the species arrived together. c. 70,000 40,000 BCE, behavioral modernity. The symbolic turn, Grade 1 distributed foundation. Grade 1, mass distributed. The emergence of symbolic thought, myth, narrative, representation, coincides with the first large-scale Grade 1 activity. Symbolic thought is not inherently pseudological, it is the precondition for truth and lie alike. But the first myths the species told itself were not primarily accurate descriptions of the world. They were preferable descriptions of the world, accounts that placed the human at the center of a meaningful cosmos, invested suffering with narrative logic, made death comprehensible. These are not lies in the ordinary sense. They are, from the pseudological perspective, the first collective Grade 1 events, beliefs maintained not because they are accurate but because they are comfort-producing. The lacunae from this period are undetectable at the individual scale and unquantifiable at the civilizational scale. They are foundational. They are baked into the load-bearing structure of every subsequent human civilization. The foundation of the structure contains, at its very base, a distributed set of small absences where the unbearable truth was replaced with the bearable story. c. 10,000 BCE, Agricultural Revolution. The first organized Grade 2, property, hierarchy, and the promise of security. Grade 2, systemic. The transition from nomadic to agricultural civilization required, and produced, the first organized Grade 2 pseudology events, the systematic relational deceptions that make large group hierarchy function. The chief who claims divine sanction for decisions made from self-interest. The priest who claims privileged access to forces that do not respond to individual supplication but happen to require grain tithes. The assertion that the arrangement is just because the alternative is chaos. These are not incidental distortions, they are the operational mechanism of the first complex societies. Settled civilization did not discover the art of structural deception. Settled civilization is the art of structural deception deployed at sufficient scale to support agricultural surplus management. Every subsequent civilization inherits this architecture. c. 5000–3000 BCE, first urban civilizations. The first Grade 3 event, accounting, record-keeping, and the deliberate false number. Grade 3, institutional. The invention of writing appears to have occurred, at least in part, for the purpose of recording true things about commodities, labor, and taxation. The second recorded use of writing appears to have been the falsification of those records. The epistemic commons, the shared pool of agreed-upon material facts, acquired its first organized Grade 3 damage in the first administrative states. The Collegium notes the speed of this. Writing as a mechanism for truth and writing as a mechanism for deliberate falsehood appear to be essentially simultaneous inventions. The capacity to record and the capacity to falsify the record arrived together, as language and deception had arrived together before it. The prehistoric record is not merely the beginning of the outer world's pseudology history. It is the demonstration that the lie craft was not introduced into an innocent civilization from outside. It was constitutive of the civilization from its first complex forms. The question of what the outer world would look like without Grade 1 through 3 activity embedded in its foundational structure is not answerable. That world would not be the outer world. It would be a different species civilization. Survey II The Ancient World. Survey Part 2. The Ancient World, Empire, Doctrine, and the First Grade 5 Events. 300 BCE 500 c. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China, Persia, India, First Grade 4V activity. The ancient civilizations of the outer world represent the first period in which Grade 4 and Grade 5 pseudology events become structurally visible. The earlier grades, the distributed Grade 1 self-myths, the Grade 2 hierarchical deceptions, the Grade 3 false accounting, continue and expand. But the ancient empires introduce something new, the systematic use of Grade 4 to manufacture an entire population's identity as an instrument of political control, and the first Grade 5 events in which the historical record itself is deliberately falsified at institutional scale. c. 1274 BCE, Egypt. Rameses II and the Battle of Kadesh, Grade 5 pioneer. Grade 5, historical rejection. The Battle of Kadesh was a military engagement between Egypt and the Hittite Empire that ended, by all contemporary evidence, in a strategic draw. Rameses II commissioned one of the most extensive propagandistic histories in the ancient record, transforming the draw into a magnificent personal victory, carved in stone across every major temple in Egypt, repeated in verse and image until the false account became the official one. This is one of the earliest clearly documented Grade 5 events. Not merely a lie told about history, but an institutional commitment to a false version of history maintained with sufficient force that the true version was effectively erased from the Egyptian record. The Hittite accounts survive. The lacuna in the Egyptian record does not know that. c. 509 BCE 27 BCE, Rome. The Roman Republic, Grade 2 at imperial scale. Grade 2, systemic, extended duration. The Roman Republic's constitutional fiction, the maintained pretense that Rome was governed by collective deliberation when it was governed by the wealthiest families, is one of the most sustained Grade II events in the ancient record. The Senate as genuine deliberative body versus the Senate as ratification theatre for oligarchic decisions, maintained for 5 centuries with sufficient ritual and ceremony that the fiction was not merely believed but performed, repeatedly and collectively, by the very people who understood it to be fiction. The Collegium notes the structural effect. The Roman Republic collapsed not when the truth emerged but when the fiction could no longer be convincingly performed, when the lacunae accumulated to the point where the load-bearing structure of the fiction itself began to fail under its own weight. What followed was not truth. What followed was Augustus, who maintained the same fiction more efficiently. 221 BCE, ongoing, China. The burning of books, Grade 5 at maximum institutional commitment. Grade 5, historical rejection, extreme. The keen emperor's burning of the books and burial of scholars represents Grade 5 at its most unambiguous. The deliberate physical destruction of the historical record as an ontological claim that the history it contained had not occurred. Not merely censorship, ontological assertion. This happened before you. It did not happen. The lacunae from this event are among the largest single Grade 5 events in the outer world's record. Entire bodies of knowledge, philosophical traditions, historical accounts, and technical literature were permanently removed from the epistemic commons. The Collegium notes that this event is widely regarded in the outer world as a historical atrocity. It is not universally acknowledged that every subsequent civilization has practiced versions of it, continuously, at varying scales, to the present day. c. 500 BCE 500 CE, Mediterranean and Near East. The Age Doctrine, Concordance Keeping as Political Architecture. Grade 4, Identity Manufacture. The great doctrinal systems of the ancient world, state religions, philosophical schools institutionalized as civic identity, the mystery cults, the imperial cult, represent the most sophisticated Grade 4 operation in the ancient record, the deliberate construction of a population's sense of cosmic and personal identity for political purposes. The distinction the Collegium draws is between genuine concordance keeping, the sincere affirmation of true things for structural purposes, and its weaponized use, the construction of elaborate identity frameworks for populations that are internally coherent, communally reinforced, and politically convenient, regardless of their accuracy. When the political requirements of the framework change, the identity changes with them. The practitioners may believe entirely in what they are performing. That is, from the pseudological perspective, worse. Every empire in the ancient world solved the same problem. How do you persuade a large number of people, most of whom you will never meet, to behave in ways that serve interests they do not share? The answer, across every civilization, was the same. You tell them a story about who they are, and you tell it with enough consistency, enough reinforcement, and enough institutional force that the story becomes load-bearing. You make the identity into a structural fact. Then you govern the structural fact, which is much easier than governing the people. Survey comment, External Division Analysis. Survey II The Age of Doctrine. Survey Part 3. The Age of Doctrine, Institutional Concordance Keeping and Tautological Collapse. 500 CE 1500 CE, Medieval Period, Global Doctrinal Systems, First Tautological Collapse Events on Record. The medieval period, across multiple civilizations and hemispheres simultaneously, represents the most extensive experiment in institutional concordance keeping the outer world has produced. Vast theological, philosophical, and cosmological systems were constructed and maintained as the load-bearing framework of civilizational self-understanding. At their best, these systems were genuine structural affirmation, the sincere, rigorous, collectively maintained assertion of what the practitioners genuinely believed to be true, reinforcing the ontological fabric of shared meaning with full conviction. At their worst, they represent the most dangerous form of Grade 4 event, a tautological collapse at civilizational scale, in which the affirmation becomes an end in itself, and the maintenance of the doctrinal structure supersedes the accuracy of what it asserts. c. 500 c. Global. The great theological systems, concordance keeping as civilization. Concordance keeping, extended duration. The medieval theological systems, Islamic scholarship, Christian scholasticism, Hindu philosophical development, Buddhist systematic thought, represent some of the most extensive concordance-keeping operations in the outer world's record. The Collegium takes no position on the truth content of these systems. What the Collegium does observe is their structural function. In each case, an immense institutional apparatus was constructed for the maintenance and transmission of a framework of collective belief, held with conviction, affirmed repeatedly and collectively, and used as the structural foundation of civilizational identity. The agreement density these systems produced was enormous. The load they added to the ontological fabric was real, regardless of the accuracy of the propositions they affirmed. The Collegium notes that this observation cuts in multiple directions. 1095-1291 c. Crusades. Holy War as Grade 4V operation. The manufactured imperative. Grade 4V combined. The Crusades represent the systematic use of Grade 4 identity construction, the Crusader as divinely mandated agent of sacred history, combined with Grade 5 historical rejection, the claim that the territories being invaded had always belonged to those invading them, that the populations living there were enemies of the true order rather than inhabitants of their ancestral lands. The lacunae from this period include the permanent structural damage to relations between Islamic and Christian civilizations that has not healed in 1,000 years, the removal from the historical record of the actual nature of pre-Crusade coexistence in the contested territories, and the Grade 4 residue in Western Christian identity that continues to shape geopolitical behavior in ways that cannot be fully explained by current material interests. Old lacunae pull truths into them across centuries. 1231-1826 c. The Inquisitions. Tautological collapse. The doctrine defends itself. Grade 6. Tautological collapse. The various Inquisition systems represent the outer world's clearest historical example of tautological collapse at institutional scale. The doctrinal structure had become so load-bearing, so deeply embedded in the ontological fabric of the civilization, that the institution itself began to organize around its own maintenance rather than its ostensible purpose. Any challenge to the doctrine was processed not as a truth claim to be evaluated but as a threat to be eliminated, because evaluating truth claims against the doctrine would introduce friction of contradiction into the structure the doctrine was supposed to reinforce. The system tortured and killed people not because the practitioners were primarily cruel, but because their conviction in the doctrinal structure was so total that evidence against it was experienced as ontological attack. The Collegium recognizes this dynamic. It is tautological collapse. It looks, from the inside, like righteousness. c. 1000-1500 c. Global. The false alchemy, Grade 3 at the epistemological foundation. Grade 3, epistemic. The alchemical tradition, across multiple cultures simultaneously, represents a peculiar and significant pseudological event. A body of Grade 3 falsehood league does not become gold. The philosopher's stone does not exist, maintained not primarily by deliberate deception but by the sincere belief of its practitioners. The alchemists were, almost universally, sincere. They believed. They published their results, complete with fabricated confirmations of experiments that did not work as described, not primarily from fraud but from the deep structural requirement that the theory be confirmed. The false results were produced by genuine conviction. The lacunae they placed in the epistemic commons were the gaps where accurate knowledge of material chemistry should have been. The Collegium notes, the alchemists were not void tongues. They were Grade 1 fabulers who had constructed a Grade 3 knowledge system on the foundation of their own sincere self-deception. The sincere lie does not only concern dramatic events. It also concerns very patient, very earnest people looking at failing experiments and recording success. Survey of the Early Modern Period. Survey Part 4. The Early Modern Period, the Amplified Lie and the Grade 5 Continent. 1450-1800 c. Print, Colonialism, Reformation, Revolution, First Mass Amplification Systems. The invention of the printing press is, from the pseudological perspective, the most significant event in the outer world's history of the art, the first technology specifically designed to amplify assertions, true and false alike, at speeds and scales that prior civilizations could not achieve. The press did not change the grades of pseudology available to the civilization. It multiplied their reach by several orders of magnitude. It also, for the first time, made concordance keeping available at similar scale, a development whose significance cannot be overstated. 1440 CE, Gutenberg. The print press, the first void tongue amplifier. Technology event, grade multiplier. A technology that amplifies assertions does not care which assertions it amplifies. The printing press enabled the rapid spread of scientific knowledge, religious reformation, and philosophical innovation. It enabled, with equal facility, the rapid spread of plague theory that killed patients, anti-Semitic libel that killed communities, and colonial ideology that killed continents. The Collegium classifies the printing press not as a pseudology event but as a pseudology multiplier, a structural change in the environment in which all subsequent grades operate. Every subsequent technology in this category, broadcast radio, broadcast television, the Internet, large-scale social media, generative AI, follows the same pattern: mutual amplification of all conviction, proportional to reach, regardless of accuracy. Each generation receives a more powerful version of the same instrument and is, each time, surprised by what it does. 1492–1900 c. The colonial period. The Grade 5 continent, colonialism as ontological project. Grade 5, historical rejection, continental scale. The colonial project was, among other things, the largest Grade 5 pseudology event in the outer world's history. The systematic assertion, maintained for 4 centuries with institutional force, that the histories, cultures, knowledge systems, relationships to land, and ontological frameworks of colonized peoples did not exist or did not count as real, that the world before the colonizer arrived was empty, or savage, or waiting. This was not merely political violence, though it was extensively that. It was an ontological claim: you were not there, your history was not history, your knowledge is not knowledge, the story begins when we arrived. The lacunae from this event are among the largest in the outer world's record. They are not historical, they are structural, they are present. Every institution, epistemological framework, legal system, and geopolitical arrangement in the current world is built on top of them, and the gravity of absence from 4 centuries of Grade 5 activity at continental scale pulls at the load-bearing structure of current civilizational consensus in ways that remain, in the present period, actively destabilizing. 1517–1648 c. Reformation and Wars of Religion. Concordance sheer at civilizational scale, the War of Testimony, European edition. Grade 6, Concordance sheer. The Protestant Reformation produced a phenomenon structurally identical to the Fourth Unraveling's War of Testimony. 2 institutional frameworks performing structural affirmation on mutually incompatible claims, each with total sincerity and total conviction, each with access to the print press amplifier, each willing to deploy the full institutional force of the civilizations it controlled in support of its truth. The wars of religion were not fought primarily over economic interests or territorial ambition, though both were present. They were fought over which version of reality was load-bearing. The lacunae from concordance sheer at this scale include the fracturing of the epistemic authority that had previously maintained the civilizational framework, the permanent damage to the concept of institutional religious authority as objective truth-keeper, and the indirect generation of the conditions for the subsequent scientific revolution, because when 2 authorities claim incompatible truths with equal conviction, the pressure to find a form of truth that does not depend on institutional authority becomes structural necessity. It is difficult to overstate how much of the outer world's current epistemological architecture, the scientific method, the concept of evidence-based reasoning, the distinction between empirical and metaphysical claims, is a consequence of Grade 6 concordance sheer. The civilization was forced, by the structural failure of competing institutional truths, to develop a mechanism for truth determination that did not rely on institutional authority. It then used that mechanism to undermine the institutional authorities that had generated the pressure to develop it. The Collegium finds this history interesting from a theoretical perspective. It also notes that the mechanism the civilization developed, Empiricism only works if the people using it are committed to updating their convictions when evidence requires it. The degree to which this commitment is currently maintained is assessed in a later section. Survey VTHE Industrial Age of Manufactured Lies. Survey Part 5. The Industrial Age, the Manufactured Lie as Mass Production. 1-800-1945-C. Advertising, Propaganda, Industrial Fraud, Mass Psychology, the First Grade 3 Factories. The Industrial Revolution transformed the production of goods. It also, less frequently observed, transformed the production of falsehood. Before industrialization, pseudology at grade 3 and above required craft, deliberate individual fabrication, institutional orchestration, manual dissemination. After industrialization, false assertions about material facts could be manufactured at the scale of mass production, distributed at the speed of the telegraph and then broadcast radio, and refined through iteration in the same way a consumer product is refined, the most effective lies field-tested and optimized for conviction yield. The outer world developed the lie crafts industrial phase with the same enthusiasm it brought to all other forms of industrial production. 1840s, present, advertising industry. Grade 1 distributed manufacturing, the industrial production of ambient drift. Grade 1, industrial scale, ongoing. The advertising industry represents the first systematic, for-profit, industrially scaled production of Grade 1 pseudology events, the deliberate creation of false or distorted self-concepts in target populations for the purpose of generating commercial behavior. Early advertising sold patent medicines. Later advertising sold the belief that using a specific laundry soap constituted being a good mother, that driving a specific vehicle constituted having achieved something meaningful, that the natural texture of one's hair was a problem requiring a commercial solution. The lacunae produced by industrial-scale Grade 1 are qualitatively different from those produced by individual self-deception. They are manufactured, they are targeted, they are optimized. The self-concept the industrial Grade 1 event damages is not produced organically by the subject's own coping mechanisms, it is produced deliberately by a third party for financial gain, and the subject is unaware of the manufacture. The Collegium notes that the outer world currently produces more Grade 1 content per second, through advertising alone, before considering social media, political messaging, entertainment, and other vectors, than any prior civilization produced in its entire existence. 1890s–1960s, tobacco industry. The perfect Grade 3 event, industrial false fact in the epistemic commons. Grade 3, deliberate, epistemic commons damage. The tobacco industry's mid-20th century campaign to manufacture doubt about the established relationship between cigarette smoking and cancer is, for the Collegium's purposes, the most clinically perfect Grade 3 event in the modern record. It is perfect not because it was the largest or most damaging, though it was both, but because it was the most methodologically explicit. The internal documents eventually made public record the industrial logic precisely. The goal is not to prove our product is safe. The goal is to create sufficient uncertainty in the public mind about the scientific consensus that the burden of proof appears unresolved. The lacuna produced was not a false fact. It was a manufactured gap in the epistemic commons, a region of deliberate uncertainty installed where there had been converging scientific certainty. The lacuna killed people who made health decisions based on the manufactured uncertainty. The internal document that articulated the strategy has been public for decades. The strategy has been adopted, refined, and applied to climate science, pharmaceutical safety, nutritional research, electoral security, and vaccine efficacy. The methodology's lacuna in the epistemic commons is not the uncertainty about tobacco. The methodology's lacuna is the public's permanent uncertainty about whether scientific consensus can be trusted at all. 1914–1918 The First World War. State propaganda as Grade 4 operation, the manufactured soldier. Grade 4, identity manufacture, state scale. The First World War produced the first large-scale, scientifically informed, state-orchestrated Grade 4 operation, the systematic construction, across entire national populations, of an identity framework that made mass participation in industrial slaughter feel not merely necessary but meaningful, righteous, even beautiful. Every combatant nation did this simultaneously. The British did it with the poster and the white feather. The German High Command did it with the press releases from Hindenburg's headquarters. The French did it with the official narratives about the poilus and their spirit. Each Grade 4 operation was competing against the other's Grade 4 operations, producing a continent-scale concordance in which every nation's population was simultaneously affirming, with total conviction, that their cause was just and the other's was monstrous. When 17 million people are dead, the Grade 4 construct must work harder to maintain itself. It does. Both sides announced victory. Both sides maintained, to their home populations, a version of the outcome that was manageable. The lacunae from this period include the structural gap where the actual experience of industrial trench warfare should be in the cultural memory of every nation that participated, the gap that would have made the Second World War politically impossible to start, if it had been honestly maintained rather than mythologized. Survey with 20th Century. Survey Part 6. The 20th Century, Grade 6 at Full Scale, Unraveling Candidates. 1917-2000 c. Totalitarianism, Genocide, Nuclear Deterrence, the Cold War. The 20th century of the outer world produced more Grade 6 events than all prior centuries combined. This is not because the people of the 20th century were uniquely susceptible to mass delusion. The preceding centuries demonstrate that mass delusion is a consistent feature of human civilization. It is because the 20th century was the first in which Grade 6 events had access to the full suite of industrial amplification technologies, mass print, broadcast radio, broadcast television, and the organizational infrastructure of the modern state. Grade 6 at full amplification is something qualitatively different from Grade 6 without it. It is Grade 6 with totalizing reach, a collective false reality that can be instantiated into every corner of a population's life simultaneously, with no refuge, no alternative voice, no external corrective. 1917-1991 c. Soviet Union. The sustained Grade 6 state, reality by institutional assertion. Grade 6, state scale, 74 years. The Soviet experiment represents the most sustained Grade 6 event in the outer world's record, a state apparatus organized around the institutional assertion of a specific version of reality, maintained with the full force of the state, censorship, re-education, imprisonment, execution, against the evidence of observable experience. The citizens of the Soviet state did not primarily believe the official version of Soviet reality because they were told to believe it. Many of them believed it because the entire social environment in which they formed beliefs confirmed it, and the cost of not believing it, of admitting to themselves, in the privacy of their own cognition, that the collective fiction was a fiction, was too high to bear. This is the Grade 6 event at its most complete, a false reality that becomes subjectively indistinguishable from true reality because the personal cost of the distinction is prohibitive. The lacunae from 74 years of Grade 6 state reality include the structural gap where an accurate account of the Soviet economic record should be, the gap where honest assessment of the collective farm system's human costs should be, and, most lastingly, the gap in 3 generations' capacity to trust institutional information sources, which persists long after the state that produced it has dissolved. 1933-1945 c. Nazi Germany. Grade 6 at maximum amplitude, the Holocaust as ontological event. Grade 6, maximum amplitude, unraveling class event. The Holocaust is, from the pseudological perspective, the most extreme Grade 6 event in the documented outer world record, the instantiation, in an industrial state, of a mass delusion of sufficient completeness and conviction that it organized the systematic murder of 11 million people. The Collegium does not use clinical language here to diminish the event's moral enormity. It uses clinical language here because the clinical language is the only language adequate to what happened. A sufficient number of people held a sufficient number of false beliefs, about the nature of Jewish people, about the nature of national identity, about the ontological status of certain categories of human being, with sufficient conviction that those beliefs became load-bearing in the structure of an entire civilization's shared reality. The Grade 6 delusion did not produce those beliefs from nothing, it assembled and amplified and purified the Grade 1 ambient drift and Grade 2 institutional deception and Grade 3 manufactured statistics that had been accumulating in European antisemitism for centuries. The Holocaust is not an anomaly. It is the result of what happens when distributed Grade 1-3 activity is allowed to accumulate, amplified by Grade 4 identity manufacture and Grade 5 historical rejection, until the accumulated structural damage is sufficient to support a Grade 6 event at state scale. The lacunae from this event are permanent. The Collegium does not believe the outer world has fully assessed what is currently missing from its structural foundation as a result of them. 1945-1991 c. The Cold War. Mutual assured Grade 2, the deterrence doctrine as sustained relational lie. Grade 2, civilizational scale, mutual. Nuclear deterrence is a Grade 2 event of unusual sophistication, a stabilizing lie maintained simultaneously by two parties, each of whom knows the other is lying, and each of whom depends on the other's willingness to continue performing the lie for their own survival. The deterrence doctrine requires that each nuclear power credibly assert its willingness to use weapons whose use would end civilization, an assertion neither party intended to make true, and which both parties maintained through the construction of an elaborate institutional apparatus designed to make the incredible seem credible. The lacunae from 45 years of this operation include the structural gap where an honest account of nuclear risk should be in the public understanding of every nuclear-armed nation, the gap in civil defense planning where genuinely useful information about nuclear survival should be, there is none. The doctrine required that there be none, because survivability undermined credibility, and the gap in international trust architecture where actual de-escalation agreements would be replaced by a system designed to maintain the threat at calibrated levels. The deterrence system worked. It produced lacunae of enormous size in exchange for not producing lacunae of civilization-ending size. The Collegium notes that the trade has not been assessed in these terms. Survey via the Information Age. Survey Part 7. The Information Age, the network as Grade 6 infrastructure. 1990-2020, c. Internet, social media, algorithmic amplification, filter bubbles. The Internet was described, at its emergence, as a tool for the liberation of information, a technology that would make it impossible for institutions to maintain Grade 3 and Grade 5 operations against a population with universal access to the global record. This prediction was structurally correct and operationally wrong in approximately equal measure. The Internet did make many Grade 3 and Grade 5 operations harder to sustain. It also created the infrastructure for Grade 6 events at scales and speeds previously impossible. A global network in which every user's belief formation environment could be algorithmically customized to confirm their existing convictions, in which false assertions could reach millions before correction reached dozens, and in which the social cost of updating a conviction in response to evidence was dramatically higher than the social cost of maintaining a false one. 1990s-2010s, the search engine period. The new epistemic commons, everything true and everything false, indistinguishable. Grade 3, epistemic commons dissolution. The pre-social media Internet dissolved the institutional gatekeeping of the epistemic commons without replacing it with an alternative quality verification system. Any assertion, regardless of accuracy, could be published at zero marginal cost and retrieved by any searcher regardless of its accuracy. This did not, in itself, produce pseudology events. What it produced was a structural environment in which the epistemic commons, the shared pool of facts a civilization uses to navigate collective decisions, could no longer be maintained by the mechanisms that had previously maintained it, while the new mechanisms, search engines, early Internet navigation, did not weight accuracy. The Grade 3 damage from this period is not from specific false assertions, it is from the dissolution of the infrastructure that distinguished true from false assertions at civilizational scale. The lacuna from this event is not located at any specific coordinate. It is diffuse. It is in the fabric of how a civilization knows what it knows. 2006 present, social media. Algorithmic concordance shear, Grade 6 infrastructure built for profit. Grade 6, infrastructure, structural. The major social media platforms of the outer world are, from the pseudological perspective, the most dangerous technological development in the history of the art. Systems engineered, deliberately and at enormous sophistication, to maximize the time users spend in engagement, and which discovered, through optimization, not malice, that outrage and confirmation produce more engagement than calm and correction. The algorithmic amplification of emotionally activating content, combined with the network effect of social reinforcement, produces an environment that is structurally identical to a grade 6 event from inside. A shared reality constructed from mutually reinforcing assertions, held with full conviction, in which contradictory evidence does not penetrate because the social environment surrounding the belief does not permit it. The distinction from prior grade 6 events is one of mechanism, not degree. Prior grade 6 events required institutional force to maintain, the state apparatus, the church, the party. Social media grade 6 maintains itself through social incentives alone. The belief persists because believing it is socially rewarded and updating it is socially costly. The system is not a tool for producing false beliefs. It is infrastructure that makes any belief, regardless of accuracy, more resistant to correction once it has achieved sufficient social mass. 2010s. Present, filter bubbles and epistemic sorting. Parallel concordance systems, the outer world's war of testimony in progress. Grade 6, concordance shear, ongoing. The outer world has, over approximately 15 years, undergone a process of epistemic sorting that the Collegium's historical analysis recognizes as structurally identical to the preconditions for the Fourth Unraveling's war of testimony, but at civilizational rather than factional scale, and with technological amplification rather than institutional enforcement. Different populations have not merely reached different political conclusions from shared evidence. They have, through the mechanism of algorithmic sorting, come to inhabit structurally distinct epistemic environments in which the basic facts are different, in which the agreed-upon ground truth from which disagreement might be navigated does not exist as shared territory. Two populations that disagree about the meaning of shared facts can negotiate. Two populations that inhabit mutually incompatible factual realities, each held with the conviction of sincere belief, cannot. The Collegium's name for this dynamic is concordance shear. The outer world's name for it is polarization. The dynamics are identical. The outcome in prior cases is on record. Survey via present moment. Survey Part 8, Current Assessment. The present, sincere lie factories and the grade 7 threshold. 2020 present, generative AI, synthetic media, the collapse of the authentic signal, current Collegium assessment. The present period of the outer world is, in the Collegium's assessment, the first period in the civilization's history in which grade 7 preconditions are being met simultaneously across multiple structural axes, not because of a single practitioner, not because of a single ideology or state apparatus, but because the technological and social infrastructure that the civilization has built over the past century has achieved, through a combination of deliberate engineering and emergent optimization. A state that the Treatise of Belief describes as the necessary condition for a distributed grade 7 event. A civilization in which the mechanisms for distinguishing conviction from verified fact have degraded to the point where sincere false belief can be produced, maintained, and amplified at scale, faster than correction can reach it. 2022 present, generative AI. The sincere lie factory, a system that cannot lie in the ordinary sense. Grade 7 precondition, structural. Generative AI systems produce content with the fluency and confidence of sincere belief and without the underlying conviction that prior grades of pseudology required. A human grade 3 void tongue knows they are producing a false material assertion. A generative AI system does not know this, cannot know this, and produces its false assertions with the same surface qualities as its true ones, which is to say, it produces something structurally analogous to a sincere lie without the subjective internal experience of sincerity, because it has no subjective internal experience at all. The Collegium has debated whether this constitutes a grade 7 precondition or a novel category outside the existing framework. The current consensus is that the framework category is not what matters. What matters is the structural effect, content produced at scale, with no friction of contradiction, with no internal counter-assertion to create a seam the universe might find, mixed indistinguishably into the epistemic commons with accurate content, read and internalized by humans who then hold its assertions with the full quality of sincere conviction. The generative AI system does not produce lacunae. The humans who sincerely believe its confabulations do. 2010s. Present, synthetic media. The authentic signals collapse. Grade 5 at the level of sense perception. Grade 5, perceptual foundation. The development of high-quality synthetic video, audio, and image, content indistinguishable from authentic documentation of real events, represents a Grade 5 event at the level of sense perception, the removal from the epistemic commons not of a historical narrative but of the evidential relationship between direct perceptual evidence and the events it documents. For the prior 400 years, a photograph was a form of structural affirmation, an assertion about what was present that derived its force from the physical causal relationship between the thing and its image. That causal relationship has been severed. The photograph no longer functions as structural affirmation. It functions as an assertion whose relationship to reality must be inferred from other evidence, which is to say, it now has the same epistemic status as any other assertion. The lacuna from this event is in the load-bearing structure of evidentiary reasoning. The civilization has lost a category of truth that it used continuously and is in the process of discovering that it has lost it. Present, ongoing. The distributed sincere lie, millions of Grade 1 events approaching Grade 7 threshold. Grade 7, threshold assessment, active. The treatise of belief's central argument, applied to the present, if the universe responds to conviction rather than content, and if Grade 1 self-deception accumulated at sufficient density and with sufficient mutual reinforcement produces load-bearing effects, then the current state of the outer world's epistemic environment constitutes not a single Grade 7 precondition but millions of distributed Grade 1 events that are approaching, collectively, a structural threshold. The individual who has been algorithmically sorted into an epistemic environment that confirms their existing convictions, who consumes content produced by systems that cannot distinguish their false outputs from true ones, who holds their resulting beliefs with the total quality of sincere conviction because those beliefs have never been structurally challenged, that individual is not a deliberate void tongue. They are not practicing the art. They are producing lacunae anyway. They are producing them in the millions. The lacunae are small. They are accumulating. The Collegium's historical record contains one prior case where this dynamic reached resolution. The case is called the Third Unraveling. The outer world calls it a legend. Current lacuna count updating, assessment in progress, rate exceeds instrument capacity. The present is not the beginning of the lie craft. It is the moment when every tool the civilization has built to amplify assertion, every press, every broadcast, every algorithm, every synthetic media system, has been aimed simultaneously at the precondition the universe has no defense against. They did not aim them deliberately. They aimed them the way any civilization aims anything, in pursuit of what worked, scaled to what could be scaled, without asking what the universe would do when it received the signal at full strength. Survey summary, external division assessment. Survey X projected futures. Survey Part 9, speculative assessment. Projected futures, 3 trajectories for the outer world. Near to far future, based on current structural analysis. Probability assessments withheld pending instrument calibration. The Collegium does not predict. Prediction is an assertion about what has not yet happened, and the Collegium's policy on unverified assertions is the reason it exists. What the Collegium does is structural analysis. Given the current state of the load-bearing framework, given the rate of lacuna accumulation, given the available mechanisms for either repair or escalation, what are the structural trajectories that the situation admits? The following 3 trajectories represent the range the Collegium's analysis has identified. They are not predictions. They are the shapes that the future could take, given the forces currently operating on the structure. Precondition. The civilization develops, or rediscovers, mechanisms for maintaining the distinction between conviction and verified fact at institutional scale, mechanisms robust enough to function in an environment of generative AI, synthetic media, and algorithmic amplification. This would require not merely better technology but a genuine shift in the social reward structure, an environment in which updating a conviction in response to evidence is more socially costly than maintaining a false one. The concordance keepers of the prior ages maintained their practice at the cost of the practice. The modern equivalent would require individuals and institutions to invest in the maintenance of accurate shared reality at the cost of the comfort of enclosure in confirming ecosystems. Structural mechanism. The distributed grade 1 events that are currently accumulating toward a threshold decelerate. The epistemic commons, currently dissolving, reforms around verification mechanisms rather than convenience mechanisms. The gravity of absence from existing lacunae continues to pull at the fabric, but the rate of new lacuna production drops below the rate at which the civilization's natural concordance maintenance can stabilize it. Historical precedent. The scientific revolution. The Reformation-induced concordance shear produced conditions in which existing truth maintenance mechanisms were destroyed, but the resulting vacuum was eventually filled with new mechanisms: empiricism, peer review, the distinction between empirical and metaphysical claims that were more robust than those they replaced. The outer world has done this before. The Collegium notes that it took approximately 200 years and several more wars. Precondition. The current trajectory continues without escalation to a single threshold crossing event. The distributed grade 1 activity continues to accumulate, the epistemic commons continues to fragment, concordance shear between parallel epistemic communities continues to deepen. Periodic grade 6 events, ideological mass movements, manufactured consensus events, large-scale information operations, produce regional or civilizational disruptions of significant but not terminal scale. The civilization manages the structural damage without repairing it, in the same way a structure can remain standing while accumulating damage that will eventually become irreparable. Structural mechanism. The load on the remaining concordant framework continues to increase. Individual lacunae remain small but numerous. Regions of ambient doubt, areas of civic, social, and epistemic life where shared reality cannot be maintained reliably, expand. The civilization's capacity to coordinate on complex collective problems that require shared factual ground, climate, pandemic, war, resource distribution, continues to degrade. The degradation is the unraveling. It does not resolve, it is managed. Historical precedent. The outer world's 20th century was, in many respects, a managed unraveling. Extraordinary grade 4, V, and VI events, distributed structural damage of enormous scale, but no single threshold crossing event. The civilization survived the century with its load-bearing framework damaged but intact. The question is whether the accumulated damage from that century, plus the current period's additional loading, leaves sufficient structural integrity for another managed century, or whether the foundation has been reduced to the point where the management requires more active force than the civilization can generate. Precondition. A grade 7 event, or, as the Treatise of Belief suggests is equally possible, the aggregate effect of distributed grade 1 events reaching critical threshold density, crosses the structural point beyond which the gravity of absence from the resulting lacunae exceeds the civilization's concordance maintenance capacity. The Collegium has 3 prior cases of unraveling class events to draw on. The 6th, the largest prior confirmed event, produced 11 lacunae over 3 months from a single practitioner. A distributed grade 7 event from a civilization of 8 billion people, with the amplification infrastructure currently in place, is not 11 lacunae. The Collegium has not modeled the outcome because the instruments required to model it are the same instruments that would be failing in the event being modeled. Structural mechanism, unknown. The Collegium's honest assessment is that this trajectory's mechanics, once the threshold is crossed, are not describable in advance from outside the event. What is observable in advance? The preconditions for this trajectory are currently present, the rate of lacuna accumulation is currently increasing, the mechanisms that might arrest the increase are currently not operating at sufficient scale. The Collegium does not know where the threshold is. The Collegium does not know whether the threshold has already been crossed and the consequences are propagating at a speed below the detection rate of current instruments. The Collegium is asking these questions from inside the world it is asking them about. Historical precedent. There is none. The prior unravelings were regional or civilizational events occurring in a fragmented world where unconstrained zones of intact reality existed adjacent to the damaged zones, providing structural support. The current outer world is not fragmented in that way. There are no intact zones adjacent to the damaged ones. The load is distributed across the entire structure. The Collegium's analysis does not extend to what happens when there is no unaffected structure to bear the load of the affected one. The Collegium notes, formally, that the three trajectories above are not equally likely and that the evidence currently favors neither I nor III but rather II, with increasing structural loading that changes the probability distribution toward III over time. The note is attached to the assessment not as a prediction but as a statement about what the structure currently looks like from outside, in full knowledge that the remaining editors are inside it, and that the assessor's own convictions are formed in the same epistemic environment they are assessing. Survey X Final Assessment. Survey Part 10, Conclusion. Final Assessment. What the structure currently looks like. Summary findings, presented without mitigation, Collegium External Division. The outer world has been practicing the lie craft for the entirety of its recorded existence, and for a considerable period before that. This is not a condemnation. The distributed Grade 1 self-deception that underlies human civilization, the comfort-producing story, the bearable account of death, the myth of collective meaning, is not separable from the civilization itself. Remove it and you do not have a more honest civilization. You have no civilization. The lie craft is load-bearing. The question has never been whether to practice it. The question has always been whether the civilization can keep the practice below the threshold at which the lacunae exceed the structural capacity to absorb them. What the current survey has found. Foundational period. Grade 1 and 2 pseudology embedded at the structural foundation of all civilizational forms. Not removable, producing continuous ambient lacuna accumulation since the first complex societies. The foundation contains the damage. The structure is built on it. Ancient, medieval period. Grade 3V events added structural level lacunae to the epistemic commons, the historical record, and collective identity. Some have healed partially through subsequent correction. Most have not. The outer world's current understanding of its own history is partial in the specific places where Grade 5 events occurred. This is not metaphorical partiality. The facts that were removed are not accessible. The gaps are permanent. Industrial 20th century. Grade 6 events at state scale, amplified by industrial media, produced lacunae of a kind and size not previously possible, not only in what is known but in the capacity to know, and in the social architecture that supports knowing. The 20th century reduced the structural integrity of the civilizational framework more than any prior period. The outer world is operating on that reduced foundation now. Present. The conditions for a distributed Grade 7 event are currently present and currently intensifying. The mechanisms by which prior grades of pseudology were eventually corrected, investigative journalism, scientific consensus, institutional accountability, the gradual restoration of accurate historical record, are each, individually, under structural stress. Their collective capacity to stabilize the foundation is lower than at any prior point in the outer world's modern history. The distributed Grade 1 accumulation rate is currently higher than at any prior point. The amplification infrastructure is currently more capable than at any prior point. These three conditions have not been simultaneously present before in the civilization's history. Near future, speculative. The threshold question. The Collegium does not know if the threshold has been crossed. It does not know what the threshold is. It does not know whether the threshold is a discrete event or a gradient. What it knows is that the structure is under load and the load is increasing, and that the civilization is, for the first time in its history, simultaneously unable to see the load clearly, unable to trust the instruments that measure it, and in possession of technologies that apply new load faster than any prior correction mechanism can remove it. Hollow diamond. The outer world is not uniquely cursed. Every civilization in the Collegium's record has practiced the lie craft. Every civilization in the Collegium's record has sustained structural damage from it. Some have recovered, some have not. The distinction, where it is visible in the record, is not between civilizations that told fewer lies, all of them told lies at every grade. The distinction is between civilizations that maintained the mechanisms for truth determination, and civilizations that allowed those mechanisms to erode while the lie craft accelerated. The outer world currently has both of those things happening at once. It is not the first civilization for which this has been true. It may be the first for which it has been true at this scale, at this speed, with these tools. We note that this survey was written from inside the world it surveys, using a framework that is itself a product of that world's intellectual traditions, assessed through the author's own convictions, which are formed in the same epistemic environment under examination. The survey cannot be outside the thing it examines. This is not a disclaimer. It is the condition of all honest witness. We are here. This is here. What we perceive is what is present to us. We know what we know. We do not pretend to know what we do not. We are offering this much, which is true. We are standing on it as long as we are able. Survey of the outer world. Status: open, no terminus date available. Infinity. The lie craft is as old as the species that practices it. The species is still here. The lacunae are still here. The structure is still standing, damaged as it is, because the aggregate concordance weight of everything the civilization has ever believed truly still exceeds the aggregate gravity of absence from everything it has believed falsely. That margin is the civilization. It is narrower than it was. It is not gone. The outer world is, as of this writing, still here. The instruments still return readings. The readings are still, partially, interpretable. This much is true. We hold this much. Survey of the Outer World, CST EXT 0W001 Collegium of Structural Truths, External Division Survey Status: open, ongoing, unresolved.